Really happy to be here. I spent a lot of time thinking about this talk because DeliveryConf came around, the opportunity arose, and I wanted to spend some time talking about things that we're not doing really well within CI/CD tooling and some of the obstacles. And so let me introduce myself. My name is Angel Rivera. I'm a developer advocate for CircleCi. Who in the room knows or is familiar with what developer advocates do? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, a couple people. So I'll explain. I started off my career in the United States Air Force. I served in the United States Air Force Space Command, which is now, I believe, United States Space Force. They made the change recently. I saw a uniform. It was camouflage. It didn't make sense to me. And I tweeted like, hey, shouldn't this be black, right? Because we're going to have operations probably in orbit and on the moon, not necessarily in landscapes like Mars yet. But so I started, working professionally, programming in the Air Force, and then I did not re-enlist. I jumped into private industry where I was working in startups, and then spent a couple years there working for a couple businesses, and then the calling to serve my country again came, and then I started doing that as a federal employee. So I was working as a civilian this time for the federal government. Spent about a little over a decade doing that. And then during that time, I learned quite a bit about operations at scale, hacking code, hacking people, right? Doing all this fun stuff that led to where I am today. Learned a lot of skills, learned how bureaucracies work. But today I work for CircleCi as a developer advocate. And for those of you that are not familiar with CircleCi, we are a continuous integration, continuous delivery platform that enables developers to build, test, and deploy their code using automation. And in my duties as a developer advocate, I spend a lot of time with folks like yourself at conferences, tech events, and I spend a lot of time learning how folks use technology. And in those conversations, I take a lot of notes, mentally, of course, and then at the end of the day, I dump that all into some sort of contemporaneous notes in a spreadsheet or in a document. But what I've done for this talk is basically compiled some of that data so that I can present to you some of my findings in my conversations as a developer advocate. So all of the data that, or the information in this talk, most of it's from experiences and conversations within the community. So let's talk about agility, right? If you look at the definition of agility, it's the ability to move quickly and easily. And that's very relevant, right, to CI/CD and DevOps. So when I was building an abstract for this talk, I was like, well, I want to talk about agility, so I'm going to smash two words together and create this new thing that I call CI/CD agility. And when I defined it, I just added the word continuously, right? So my definition is the ability to move continuously, quickly, and easily. And that's for CI/CD agility, which is, again, pertinent to the talk. And like I mentioned earlier, this talk I want to focus on some of the CI/CD tooling obstacles that folks had described to me in my conversations and experience with them. So one of the things I'm focusing on in the theme is basically managing pipelines at scale. And the two things I'm going to focus in on directly is security and pipeline sprawl. So let's talk about security. So in this portion of the talk, security is very important, right? We all know that without it, we're susceptible and open for compromise and exposure, And I learned a lot of lessons working in the federal government, right? I learned a lot about how to lock things down, how to lock things down at scale. But today I'm going to focus on one of the topics that came up consistently in my conversations, which is basically secrets. Who in this room is managing secrets in their CI/CD pipelines? Good. So as we all know, right, secrets provide access to systems. They provide us the ability, or our pipelines, the ability to go ahead and connect to other resources that we use in our pipelines, right? So if we're moving bits of data, we're uploading artifacts to certain systems like S3, which I'll be using as an example throughout this talk. Secrets are an essential credential to have, right? Unfortunately, today's CI/CD tooling, in most cases, they have inadequate mechanisms. Sometimes there's really nice encryption mechanisms within the tooling, but then once some of that information that's encrypted hits the runtime that we're running our applications in, right? Boom, security kind of goes out the window. And I'm speaking to things like environment variables with sensitive keys being presented to the users of this runtime environment in clear text, and unencrypted data being pushed around between, internally within the platform, but it's still unencrypted. And that opens you up to a lot of exposure on that end. So as a industry, we need to do better. Here's some examples, right? Weak passwords, right? We use them as secrets. Static or stale passwords. I spoke to a gentleman not too long ago, and he told me, hey, I haven't changed my AWS keys in about 5 years. And the reason he gave me was, I don't know what effects that will have, right? What kind of impacts that'll create if I change my keys. That was a pretty scary conversation. And I won't reveal where the gentleman worked, but it's a financial institution. So, having described all those kind of secrets and pain points with secrets, our pipelines are exposed, right? And like I said, as an industry, this is occurring in almost every CI/CD tooling that I can think of in all my discussions as well. So we need to do better, and we need to clean up the exposures that we have in our pipelines. So you're probably asking yourself, okay, Angel, what's inadequate protection, right? What can we do? And my recommendation and in my conversations, of course, the secrets, management of secrets kind of came up, right? Who here is implementing secrets or managing their secrets with a tool? Anybody in the room? Raise your hands. Cool. Who's using, my preference is HashiCorp's Vault, but who's using that in the room? All right, cool. So you're all aware of some of those benefits. With the tooling, right, you can keep your secrets protected pretty much through the life cycle of the transactions that are occurring within your pipelines. And one of the ways you can do that is the systems enable you to create strong random passwords or secrets, right? And they generate that automatically for you. The benefit of that is the system is actually doing all the work. There's not a human involved trying to create a password that they can remember and access the system with later on. That's a big pain point. But the random password generation helps with that, right? Enables you to create policies so that you can rotate your passwords, right? So if your pipeline is using a token and you have a policy that says, hey, I need you to automate or randomly generate a stronger password and then inject that password into, exchange the password that's existing in the system with a rotation with these new passwords or credentials. These systems can do that for you, right? Obviously, you have to stand that up and configure it, but it's possible. And it does add a huge layer of protection, right, that you didn't have before. So now I described ways to secure your pipeline and your secrets within your pipelines. I want to do a recap on the security, right? So implement secrets, management policies and tooling. Integrate that tooling into your pipelines by generating strong random secrets, credentials, and auto-rotate replace secrets used in pipelines, right? These are common sense things, but believe me, there's a lot more people that don't understand this and don't even implement it, don't even think about it, than there are that like in this room, we have folks that work with it, they know this stuff. So the next topic I want to talk about is pipeline sprawl, which should impact pretty much everyone in the room who uses any CI/CD tooling. So in modern CI/CD tooling, we're using configuration files that live with our code, right? And these configuration files contain the directives for our pipeline. So we define the pipeline within this configuration file, and when we push any code changes to the repo, the CI/CD tooling platform will detect those changes and then kick off the instructions within this configuration file. It's a 1-to-1 ratio, right? So if you have a code repo, one code repo equals one pipeline config. That's the math, right? Now, let's talk a little about the syntax within these config files. Currently, I have yet to see any new CI/CD tooling come out that's not YAML-based. YAML apparently is the de facto cloud-native kind of data structure that's used in Kubernetes and a lot of other open source projects. And I don't think it's going away. But YAML is not a programming language. A lot of folks that I speak with, they complain about not being able to do iterations within YAML or change values within YAML. And I tell them, yeah, that's because it's not a programming language. It's a data structure. It's no different. Well, aside from the cosmetics of the syntax, it's no different than a JSON data structure, right? The one glaring difference is YAML is very declarative. So, you can do some human readable kind of things without having all that curly brackets and quotes and stuff around the values within that data structure. YAML is also very limited, right? So again, it's not a programming language, so you can't create these logical operations within the data structure. And what that leads to is, since it's declarative, it becomes redundant, right? So if you want to, like we're using commands in this YAML, right? If you want to execute something and it's being done 10 times, you can create an anchor, but then these values, right, change, and there is no parameterization, so to speak. Excuse me, native parameterization. So with that redundancy, your configuration files, they grow, right, in complexity, in length, the amount of lines of code grow, and it just becomes completely hard to navigate and maintain and manage, right? I was speaking with a CircleCi user not too long ago, and he showed me a config file with 12,000 lines in it. So imagine having to be that person managing that file, right, and that pipeline. I mean, he had tears in his eyes, to be honest, and so did I when hearing this and seeing this thing. I was like, whoa. So when you have that situation, I call that configuration repo sprawl, right? So remember the one-to-one ratio. And imagine, I spoke to, at reInvent, I spoke to a person who told me he has 3,500 repos, right? His team, his organization. So how do you manage all that configuration? Manually, right? Even if you script it, you still have to validate the changes and understand, like, that's a lot of, just preparing for something like that, it's gonna be astronomical. It's almost impossible. And he told me, he's like, honestly, we really don't make a lot of changes, obviously. So because of that sprawl, right, the pipelines are difficult to maintain, as you all could imagine. And I come to this conclusion that we have a dilemma, right? And how do we solve that? A couple people mentioned, hey, let's implement GitOps. But if you look at what GitOps really is, right, you're just using your Git repo as a source of truth, and you're performing operations within that repo. So it doesn't really apply, right? It's not a viable solution to solve some of these pipeline sprawl problems. So what are our options? In speaking with folks, and my own opinions as well, my own experiences, I tend to deploy or implement object-oriented programming paradigms, right? So start doing separations of concerns. So the first thing when you're doing this is to identify common pipeline patterns. So using the example of an S3 upload, let's say you have 100 repos. That means you have 100 config files. You may have, let's just say we have one upload to S3, right, in this configuration. That means you have 100 changes to make, right, if there's something that needs to be changed. So at that point, we have to identify what those changes are, create the abstractions for that, and then encapsulate it. So again, standard OOP, right, paradigm, create a class, and then from there, give it the functionality it needs, the parameters that you need for it to be a flexible piece of software. So again, you're parameterizing, creating modules, right, and templates. So I would recommend, if you're managing more than 3 repos or code bases and you're running it through CI, don't hard code commands into your YAML or configs. And this is a good example of what a hard-coded command looks like, right? So this is taken out of a standard CircleCi configuration, but basically, right, the crux of it is this thing here at the bottom. What we're doing here is calling an AWS CLI and declaring an S3 transaction, and we're doing a copy command of this jar up into this bucket, right? Real simple, but imagine if you had to do that 1,000 times in 1,000 different config files. I mean, like I said, you could automate that, but the change would be so vast. I mean, now you're just engineering automation for your automation. So I propose using scripts, right? This has worked for me in the past very well. It takes some time and effort, but once you have these encapsulations worked out, right, you can start doing cool stuff like that command. This is the same example, right? Uploading to S3 bucket. But what I'm doing is I'm saying, all right, call this executable, right? This S3 upload SSH, and then within there, obviously, you're going to have that S3 command, and then you have some parameters, right, that you can just inject. So now, what did I do? There you go. All right, cool. All right, so now you have that functionality kind of, again, separated, right, from your config file. So what we're doing is creating pipeline libraries. Now, I know it may feel like a lot of work, but right now, currently in the industry, this is one of the only ways to kind of combat pipeline sprawl. I really don't see another way to do it, generally across all the different tooling. It also, side effect here, is it minimizes vendor lock-in. And the reason I say that is once you divorce the commands from that YAML file, now you have the capability of a lot more flexibility using bash, right? So now those YAML files can call these scripts instead of straight up being hard-coded into the configuration in the pipeline. At CircleCi, we actually built a feature called Orbs. And anybody in the room CircleCi users? Anybody know Orbs? Okay, well, so if you're a CircleCi user, you should check out Orbs. If you're managing more than, I would say 3 pipelines. What we've done is done that hard work, right, the heavy lifting. And this is pretty much available for free. CircleCi is a proprietary tool, but we always give back to the developers and our open source communities. And Orbs is an open source project/feature where folks can create all of this encapsulation and parameterize YAML and then share it as well if you decide to do so. At CircleCi, we have it's native, right, to the cloud platform. So we host all of this stuff in what we call CircleCi Orbs Registry. And believe it or not, a lot of our partners, like I won't say AWS, but HashiCorp, they're building a Terraform Orb as we speak. Octopus is building an Orb. And what that enables us to do is offer up this functionality and the usage of these third-party tools from our partners and easily streamline that into your config. So you don't have to write all that encapsulation and separation. It's already done for you. All you have to do is call it like an inline call, right? And that also gives the partners a source of truth to change, like a one-stop shop, to change that code if they need to, and then just update a version. And that would be the only thing you needed to do in your pipelines. So quick recap on pipeline sprawl. It's identifying common patterns in pipelines, right? And then encapsulate that functionality into parameterized scripts, and then use the scripts to centrally manage the code. And one of the side effects is it will help you minimize vendor lock-in and adds a ton of portability. This is the end of my talk. Wow, it's 10 minutes early. But we can do questions, or do you want to do that 20-minute deal? Or? And by the way, I'm at the booth at CircleCi, we're sponsoring, so if you want to talk to me more about this or tell me I'm full of shit or whatever, just come see me and we'll have that discussion. So thank you.
Just because we have some time, if we'd like to do a Q&A, if there are questions in the room, if there aren't, then we can obviously move into the discussion.
Come on, give me one question, please. 2 questions, awesome.
You mentioned about a single artifact per repository and a single pipeline per repository. How do you do that and still share features and techniques for? So the example I'm thinking of, we have a Packer repository for we build all our images because there's shared code there. How do you manage that?
So the question is, I'm sorry, I'm a little lost in that one. Say it again. Clarify.
How do you deal with multiple artifacts coming out of a repository if you have a single pipeline?
Oh, I see. So like a build matrix type of scenario. Yeah, so honestly, I believe CircleCi is working on adding some sort of native, build matrix type scenario so that you can kind of say, hey, here's a range of, versions of things that you want to build. I think particularly we're going to be doing more on the language front, right? So like NPM installs and stuff like that. You can run tests and stuff against your language. But there's ways you can do that, again, by extrapolating, maybe scripting out, that capability and then having a range of things within that script. So unfortunately, you have to do some programming outside of the YAML, but again, controlling that configuration, and the scale is what we're trying to solve here. I hope that answers the question a little bit. There was another one? Oh, yeah, cool.
So in terms of the sprawl, though, so I totally get, creating the functions and how that, all the benefits that has, but to some extent, I mean, the sprawl is still there. I mean, even if you're, so that you give the example of the guy who has 35,000 lines in or 12,000 lines, I mean, he'll be able to reduce it to some extent, but it's really a matter of the number of actions that he's doing in that particular, so what is even happening in something that's that complex? Isn't there something more on an architectural level that needs to be rethought?
Absolutely, I totally agree. And what I'm offering is a solution present day, right? And that's where we need to do better as an industry. So CI/CD, right? It's getting a lot of attention now, right? We got the first delivery conf. So I think now that we have the attention of, the people are realizing the value, we're going to see huge progress, right? I've already seen it in the year and almost 2 years I've been working with Circle, how the industry's like, oh shit, we need to catch up, right? Like GitHub Actions, right? GitLab is pumping out things. So I think in the future, we're going to have, like you said, architectural changes that will, help with this, right? So, but right now, I think creating a source of truth and a one-stop shop kind of, blueprint template helps. It's not the silver bullet, right? And I don't know how we'll get there, but I'm pretty sure it'll involve a database of some sort, right? And exactly. Thank you.
Oh, I just wanted to highlight on the 12,000 line YAML file. Probably not every one of those lines is parameters that are actually interesting.
No, right.
So if you can distill it down to what are the parameters needed to fill in the YAML file, you get a lot smaller thing that teams can manage.
That's right.
I actually wanted to take a little bit of issue with the one config to one repo assertion that you made. In our project, we are actually maintaining the last 5 releases. So we actually have one repo with 5 branches, which we'd like to have the build system be able to generate artifacts when there's a security issue. Actually, technically, our customers would like that. We would prefer not to have to do it, but we'd also like to have customers.
Like I said, I was talking to the general, right? Like those are definitely, I've heard this before as well, right? Like this by no means encompasses everyone's scenario, but in those situations, right? That's just an offering of advice right here that could help. But definitely, I know of a couple of users that manage multiple branches, and that's how they kind of get with the build matrix that we were talking about earlier. That's how they do it. It's like, whoa, really? You keep a separate version. But anyway, thank you for any other questions. I guess we're going into the second phase.
Thank you for the questions. Let's get into the discussion.
Awesome.
Well, I sort of wanted to call out the use of YAML as a data format seems totally reasonable, but I think we should be thinking about how do we generate that YAML with better languages. The nice thing about having YAML as a base interchange format, or JSON, fine with either one, is that it means that there's lots of different tools that can meet at that level. But just because that's where you meet doesn't mean that's what the humans have to write once you start getting sophisticated. It's great for bootstrapping too, because you're like, oh, I just write this stuff. But then as stuff gets a little more complicated, I'd love to see more solutions that actually say, we'll generate that YAML for you.
I have many challenges. One of which is kind of an adoption of GetFlow workflow with multiple branches and trying to understand maybe the interpretation of GetFlow workflow and how maybe we're doing it wrong and and trying to get back to a thing where we're delivering the same package to each environment instead of building debug, building release, building out of a develop branch, building out of a release branch, building out of master. How do we handle hot fixes and tag things appropriately? Those are all the kinds of things, and I'm hoping that maybe implementing fresh CircleCi from the beginning, we can kind of reverse engineer our workflow to fit with the new tool.
Challenges come back to multiple artifacts per repository, multiple pipelines per repository, and then trying to work out when you should and shouldn't build. Because at the moment we have a setup where we have multiple artifacts coming out, and we make a change to the release branch, and we end up building all of the artifacts, and some of them are pointless. Is there other techniques for spotting that and reducing the duplication?
Other challenges?
Well, I sort of had a comment on the reducing the duplication. If you have reproducible builds, then they should have the same checksum, but that's really hard to do. Yeah, that would be, either that or you need something that's a lot more aware of your dependencies, something like Bazel, but then the rules are long.
So I have some thoughts on the duplication piece. So I have this concept spinning around in my head for a couple months now of, and I'll probably write a blog about it soon, but basically it's autonomous automation, right? So maybe leveraging machine learning, next level shit, right? Leveraging like machine learning, AI to kind of help out with that, right? So if you have a pattern that says, all right, these builds are hardly ever deployed, then maybe we shouldn't be building them, or build them and stuff them in S3 or wherever, right? So they're there and available. So like I said, this is because the industry is now focused on this type of automation, but I think next level stuff is going to be implementing smart kind of autonomous pipelining to help with certain patterns, right? Like just identifying. And I think those are easy kills or low-hanging fruit that we could actually tackle today as an industry.
If you're working within a single language, you actually don't need that as long as you have the compiler tree. You can figure out, hey, I touched these things. Which of these build outputs actually is affected? But maybe we need language communities to be better about actually providing tools to answer those kinds of questions. Go has a nice build library that lets you basically take that part of the compiler and figure out, hey, what modules do I depend on and stuff like that.
Security is another thing that is really like one of my passions within pipelines. We really need to do a lot better job at securing not only the secrets, but just the pipeline in general, because at the end of the day, we at DevOps we say, oh, move fast, break things, but we should be doing that securely, right? Like, and that kind of gets left out in the weeds. Like DevSecOps now is a thing after how many years DevOps has been around. Now that conversation is happening, whereas it should have been flipped, right? It should have been DevSecOps first, and then, in my opinion, and then working our way backwards.
It actually was, but people ignored it.
Yeah, no, right, exactly. But that's what I'm trying to say is like they go for the easy kills, like I say. So yeah.
A nice segue into the next question. What are the successes that you're seeing or that you have, or success stories within the organization or code base?
I'll start. We've been doing pipeline as code using libraries with pattern of 15 different languages, which use the same components to deploy, test, and do whatever, using the Jenkins DSL. And I was looking when I gave a first talk about it, that was 2017, so we've been doing that for quite a while. It definitely is possible, even with what some people call legacy tools like Jenkins, which don't use YAML.
Well, they have a plugin for YAML now,
right? Carl, just come up here so he can join the discussion.
I think one of the places where I've seen a lot of success is giving teams autonomy to set up their own configurations of, shared CI/CD resources. So one team maintains, a pool of Jenkins instances or, CircleCi or something like that, and then each team is responsible for plugging in the build pieces they need, but they don't have to think about the infrastructure and that Jenkins server sitting somewhere. And ideally, the infrastructure teams are actually destroying and redeploying those Jenkins instances on a regular basis so that you have to have the setup encoded in your system. And if you don't, it keeps biting you. And so you go and fix it because it hurts.
Also, you need a pipeline for your pipeline as code.
Autonomous pipelines, come on, it's coming.
The success we've seen is in similar to what was just been mentioned, reusable tools or reusable Jenkins models. So we were working predominantly within the infrastructure area of our group. How do we build a pipeline for these things? How do we make repeatable Jenkins instances for these things? And other parts of the organization have unexpectedly taken it and replaced legacy tools with it and are using it for completely different purposes. But because we have, Jenkins in Docker deployed by Puppet with a repeatable tunable pattern, it's been easy for other people to pick up and reduce the effort required for other people to pick up. So we're, as soon as any organization stops doing things manually and applies some kind of automation to it and process to it, we're in a better position than we were yesterday.
So how do you maintain, policies and integrity? Is it through the Chef or Puppet vehicles, or how do you keep people from going rogue and doing unintended things that shouldn't be done with that automation? Because I've seen that in organizations. You give a little bit of knowledge and the tools, and it goes it can go creative, but it can go terribly wrong as well, right? And cause a lot of pain.
We're not. we're trusting people to be. Yeah, we're trusting people to be adults and fixing the problems that they have, and then us not restricting them. It's kind of, they've got something they're doing manually and they want to do a better way. We do everything we can to help them. So we're not restricting people. Yeah, we're not.
It just comes from my old, working in the military federal. You just see people, and it's not that they're doing it intentionally. They just don't know, right? So, wow, I'm uploading a certain way, and it's bogging everyone else down, right? Like instead of doing a partial, multi-part upload or something, it's like, oh no, here, just throttle it all up. So that's.
Yeah, actually, I have an answer to that. There are tools out there. So, as an example, there's an open source tool called Terraform Compliance, right? So you just have to add something like that. You have to add that into the pipeline. For every, let's say, tool that you're using, you may need to add an additional layer, which is, are you complying to what we say should be done?
Isn't Chef Inspect like a templating tool that you could leverage, right, for those particular kind of policies that you want to enforce?
Not in a pipipeline, but yeah.
Right. But
there's even like YAML linters. There's YAML linters that you could then apply conformance upon. There's all sorts of things.
Yeah, you could use kubeeval and kube control, and then basically use that to limit what you deploy.
Yeah.
That's
I think so I actually work on a CD tool at Puppet for infrastructure, and like one of the things that I'm really seeing success in with customers that use the product that I work on is being able to give each of their teams autonomous pipelines for their piece of the infrastructure code, but there has to be a point of integration where it all comes together, and that's where you do your compliance checks. Because if you're doing your compliance checks and all of your, like pre-flight checks prior to the integration, you may get into the integration phase and like turns out you turned on a flag somewhere else and like bad things happen. So you have to have that point of integration. But the challenge today is that the tooling out there makes that really freaking hard. It's really, really difficult to build that in a reusable way. So I really like what you said about reusable content. What we need is tooling that allows for independent pipelines that can be integrated into a single path to production at one point, but be able to leverage reusable deployment content for each of those in autonomous pipelines. That kind of like, that's the only way to scale out infrastructure code to an entire organization and actually have it work.
From what you just said, path to production and pipeline are different, and I think identifying that they are two different things is probably the step one.
Yeah, actually, so one of the things I was talking about with a colleague a few weeks ago is this was particular to containers, but for example, if you if you have a signature from your container, and actually when I was on a call with Sonatype learning about what they do, they're like, well, we can keep that signature, and we can, so that kind of gives a certain, it allows the developer to say, okay, I've sent my container off to your bakery to get it done, and I get a signature back, and then I do then I can do whatever I want, as long as I haven't changed, certain aspects of my code. Then I can just push through. I'm allowed to go in. I'm allowed to take that path to production.
That reminds me of a startup idea I had a couple years ago where I was like, oh yeah, let's put like code, DNA into code, right? And that's similar to what we're talking about here is, you can basically have a trust factor. I don't know how the hell you would get that done, but that's why it's not a startup right now, but yeah. In the future.
That's a good segue into the next topic. What would you want to see in the next 2 to 5 years?
Can we get political?
So one thing I'd love to see more of is the ability for developers to put their configuration into their code by things like, in Java, an annotation or something like that they could put on their main class that says, hey, this is a 12-factor application that speaks HTTP. Please deploy it that way. And that, lets them just get all of that deployment information, and then there's some tools behind the scenes that maybe write to Kubernetes YAML and writes a Docker file and packages it all up, but they don't have to worry about that. A little step in that direction, if people have seen Gazelle as a tool that takes your Go files and writes Basel rules for them. Basel rules can be long and complicated, and there's no reason that they couldn't just be computer generated. So I'd love to see more places where we can get short, pithy statements that humans write, and then, long instructions for computers later.
Well, you can also kind of do, so for example, if you're using Packer and Ansible, you can create instead of creating a Docker file, you can use the YAML of the Ansible to create your Docker image, which means that if you're using some kind of refactoring, if all you're doing in a given project is, microservices, then you just tell everyone, well, here's the template for creating it, and all it should really have to do is say, well, here's my code, because it's all going to go in the same place in each given container image.
Yeah. Except I want it to also include the deployment configuration in those, in those annotations, or if you have to, a YAML file, so that you actually get your Kubernetes YAML out too, and you stop being a YAML herder for Kubernetes.
I'm not very smart, so I'd like to see like some rules or best practices, maybe some sort of qualification or certification that we're going the right direction with DevOps. When we talk about pipelining, we talk about Sprawl, and we talk about all these tools. It's very much a choose your own adventure, and sometimes that's hard to sell when you lack confidence, which is definitely me.
Simon know what I'm gonna say, but the biggest scam ever sold is that you can certify somebody for being DevOps.
Start with Microsoft.
Are you looking for like case studies where you can say, look how this has improved things, or more of a, you know, hey, here's a roadmap of tools to adopt and the order to adopt them in and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it's less a certification, but maybe a list of qualifiers. What are the things that I can do to baseline, and what types of targets am I looking for? Is it just pure number of deliveries that I make into production? Is it overall quality of the code?
Successful deliveries?
Second, yes.
2 to 5 years, to go back to that, I think when we talk about pipelines now, we're talking about how you build a binary and put it in front of a customer, or put it in front of somebody, or make it available for deployment by something. There was a great talk yesterday on continuous delivery for machine learning, which kind of makes me think the pipelines need to be opened wider. We're delivering more things. A pipeline should not be about building a single binary. A pipeline should be about how do we build the thing where this thing lives as well. So can I define inside a single repo or whatever the technique is, this is where the infrastructure, this is what the infrastructure looks like, this is how you get DNS to point to it, this is, you know, all of the components, because a single binary is a small part of the problem, and you have a whole load of other stuff there that needs to be right before it's visible in front of somebody. And a pipeline right now is about the small component that relies on a lot of other things. That might just be grown-up PaaS platforms, I don't know.
Everything is a pipeline.
In 2 to 5 years, I'd like to see corporations start pulling back, at least from having so much control in open source projects, and kind of giving that back to the people, because I think right now they're way too involved, and it's not a good thing. I don't think the open source community is suffering from that. And I believe that we have folks that are building these things because of their passions and their expertise and their contributing time, and now we have
vulture capitalists.
Yes. Well, no, not the capitalists. I mean, they should be compensated, in my opinion.
No. I mean the VCs that are pushing a wrong business model.
Yeah. But that's one of the things I would like to see change in open source is get it back to where it was a couple of years ago.
Final thoughts, I guess. In the next 2 to 5 years, what I'd really love to see is the operations side of IT to really embrace continuous delivery across the entire organization in order to take their gargantuan org scales and make them operate as if they were much smaller.
Right. We'll do a quick wrap up. And thank you for the participation. Thank you for the discussion. And obviously the discussion doesn't end here. Lunch, break rooms, whatever else. Thank you, Angel, for the talk. And thank you, everyone, for attending.